Instantly Salem raised his wand, which emitted a strange green mana with several serpents, and stated that from now on, anyone who tried to touch Andreas Cromwell would be killed. To which the member of the congregation, who was sleeping just a moment ago, blushed in excitement and said that they won't touch Andreas, while the huge monster-like member stood beside her in shock. Salem, with a cunning smile, continued if anyone dared to question this later, he would find and kill them. Listening to Salem, Jester, who was standing silently, asked Salem if he was really going to fight them over a kid like that, further questioning him if he was serious. In response, Salem just laughed and told Jester that he already knew what he was like, and that he wouldn't tell a lie like that. Frustrated by all this, the purple-haired lady sighed in anger as she asked Salem if he was joking with her. Furious at their words, Salem couldn't contain his anger. As his eyes turned red with fury, he questioned them if he really had to repeat himself again. As Salem threatened them, Jester and the purple-haired lady stood in silence as they stared at him. It was not just them. Sharon and Dragon also looked worried as they witnessed all this, while the other lady with white hair looked excited along with a puzzled, huge, monstrous member who could not believe what Andreas and Salem were doing. Breaking the silence, Jester claimed it couldn't be helped, and turning towards Andreas called him Karen's disciple and asked him what was that he wanted. Hearing Jester, everyone just stood in silence. Then Andreas, who was moaning in pain, decided to end his act and took out a healing potion. Then after Andreas drank the potion, he dropped the bottle on the floor, which again caught the attention of everyone. As the potion started to heal his wounds, Andreas returned his sword back in his inventory and grabbed the chest where he had stabbed himself. With blood still dripping from his mouth, he glanced at the members and thanked everyone for waiting. Abruptly, Jester told Andreas to tell them what he wanted from them. To which Andreas, who looked confused, wiping the blood from his mouth, asked Jester if he could tell him what he could get for it. Surprised by Andreas' words, Jester pointed out how ridiculous it was, as he didn't even know what he wanted. So Jester raised his left hand and started to use his magic while telling Andreas to take 5 items from that list, further warning him to choose carefully. Instantly, a long scroll was summoned by Jester's magic. Showing the scroll to Andreas, he stated that there were also corpses in there too. Analyzing the scroll, Andreas thought in the back of his mind about the corpses Jester mentioned, further wondering how it was the congregation, so they must have some good corpses. Immediately, something caught his attention. It was none other than the corpse of the former Fairy Queen, Mylene, and the Tiger King Timer. He instantly knew they were first-class materials, and with his eyes wide open, Andreas decided that he must get them. Abruptly, the huge monstrous member called for Jester and told him that those corpses had already been sold to Mourn, and if he gave them to Andreas, Mourn would definitely be furious. While the white-haired girl jumped and grabbed the huge member in excitement. As Andreas heard the name Mourn, he immediately recognized who it was. He then questioned himself if they were saying that those corpses had been bought by the leading figure of necromancy, which made him wary, as he thought if he messed with him, things would get problematic, and decided to give up on them. Out of nowhere, a voice echoed, stating how he didn't mind and that Andreas could take the corpses. Andreas, who was stunned as he heard the voice, instantly recognized who it was and stared at the direction from where the voice came. Not only Andreas, but everyone present there were also stunned to hear the voice of Mourn and turned back towards the direction, while Salem smiled and wondered how generous it was of him. It was now obvious that the voice was none other than Mourn, who had been monitoring all this with a small undead fly. Immediately, Sharon, who was behind Andreas watching all this with a puzzled look, called the Fly Master. Bewildered by the whole situation, Sharon further yelled, stating how Andreas didn't have the ability to handle those corpses yet. In response, the Fly, calling Sharon, pointed out that he said he didn't mind. Then calling for Andreas, the Fly said that the corpses were in his subspace bag and told him to take the whole bag with him. Meanwhile, the white-hair member leaned close to the small Fly with curiosity. Hearing Mourn say all this through the Fly shocked Andreas, leaving his two stunned to respond immediately, while Salem, standing beside Andreas, thought how Andreas had earned it. Andreas, with a worried look, couldn't comprehend why Mourn was being so generous, but still knew that he couldn't let that opportunity pass. Bowing his head, Andreas claimed how grateful he was for Sir Mourn's generosity and stated how he would now be selecting the rest of the items, including the corpses. Meanwhile, Sharon bit his lips in frustration as he wondered how he should have brought the page of sloth there by himself. In just a few moments, Andreas told the names of all the items he needed, and Jester instantly gave all of them to him. The items he chose were Moon's Blessing, Blue Canangulus Flowers, Yobin's Roots, Fairy's Tears, Kidanon's Jewel, Fairy Queen Millie's Corpse, and Timer's Corpse. Looking at the items Andreas chose, Salem called Andreas Kid and told him that there were better things in there and questioned him if he was really sure he wanted those, to which Andreas, who was packing the items, responded, stating for him, those were very valuable. As Andreas finished his packing, he wondered how he could make a total of 4 potions with these items, and that they were worth several 100 million wills. Then he was satisfied as he thought about how he ended up picking out ingredients for Lucia's cure too. Jester, who was patiently waiting, told Andreas to hand over the page of sloth now to him. Responding affirmatively, Andreas then proceeded to open his portal to take the page of sloth out, while Dragan, who was standing behind Andreas, looked intently at the portal opening. Andreas then passed the page of sloth to them, while Jester with his magic made the page of sloth float towards him. Abruptly, Salem sneaked behind Andreas as he passed the page of sloth and told him to get ready to go immediately, to which Andreas, hearing all, could only stand in surprise. Immediately after Andreas passed the page of sloth, Salem launched his attack at the walls of the tower and grabbed Andreas by his robe and dashed out of the tower. Everyone who witnessed this were startled as they watched Salem leap out of the hole he created and yelled at others to go after them. Meanwhile, Andreas, with a look of bewilderment, held his bag tightly as Salem dragged him as he flew away, watching the tower. As they were flying away, Andreas stated that they were planning to get rid of him once he gave them the page of sloth, to which Salem agreed, stating, correct, and glanced towards Andreas. He proceeded saying, a promise is a promise, and that he would take him to a safe place, further asking Andreas where he wanted him to take him. Glancing back at Salem, Andreas said he would like to go back to the academy and requested him to take him to the nearest train station. As they flew past the forest, Salem with a surprised tone asked, the Rodlin Academy, to which Andreas agreed. Instantly, Salem questioned Andreas if Bart knew he was a black mage. With a surprised look, Andreas glanced back at Salem and sarcastically questioned if he knew, then he wouldn't have been alive, would he? Agreeing to Andreas, Salem exclaimed how fate is a curious thing, and further stated that he would figure everything out when the time comes. Meanwhile, Andreas, trying to comprehend what Salem just said, asked what on earth he was talking about. Salem replied, stating as he told him earlier on their way there, just keep struggling as long as you can survive. Then Andreas will definitely find out who he is. Soon, Andreas reached his dormitory. As they slowly took out the items they received from the congregation, the first one was the former fairy queen Mylene's corpse. Struggling and gasping for breath, the other one was the Tiger King Timer's corpse. Taking deep long breaths, Andreas told how something this big could fit into it, claiming the subspace bag was really handy. Raising both of his hands, he cast a spell opening his portals and started to wonder how he had no choice but to summon Nickel as a skeleton. But for these two, it would be better to increase his necromancy levels and turn them into high-level summons. But for now, he would keep them inside his portals. Both of them glanced at the final item that was left in the bag. Then Andreas said, and now, and picked it up, wondering, a book. Suddenly, a notification popped up stating it was Mourn's Black Magic Tome, a high-level skill book written personally by Mourn. As he opened the book, he was so shocked that he questioned himself if it was a gift from Mourn. As he continued reading, he realized the book contained a lot of knowledge that he couldn't get at Karen's library, and if he were to read this, he would be able to turn the corpses he got today into high-level summons. Suddenly, something caught his attention. As he turned back thinking what it was, a notification popped up above Nickel stating, Skeleton Soldier Legendary's evolution probability was 100%, and there were 66 possible divergences of evolution, and if he wanted to evolve it. Looking at Nickel, he thought how he was wondering when he would be able to evolve him, but it seemed like the time had finally come. The fact that the status window appeared right after he gave the page of sloth away, and it looked like the codex had an effect on the evolution, but worrying about it won't give him any answers, so there was no point thinking about it, and it said 100%, so he decided to evolve it first. Then he clicked on the yes button. Suddenly, Nickel thought he was about to feel the surge of power. But he didn't feel what he thought he would feel, and looked at both his hands as he clenched them, trying to feel the power. Meanwhile, the status window showed that the evolving rate was 0.1% completed. Andreas, in the back of his mind, wondered how Nickel didn't seem to suffer like a vampire, and maybe it was because he was an undead. Suddenly, he was interrupted by someone knocking on the door. He instantly opened the portal for Nickel to get in and ran towards the door, walking who it was while Nickel was peeking through the portal, wondering who it might be. It was Lucia Everlast, who addressed Andreas as senior and asked him if he had a moment, to which Andreas exclaimed, Lucia. Meanwhile, inside Mourn's castle, Salem and Mourn were sitting across from each other. Salem addressed him as Gramps Mourn and asked if he could ask him something, to which Mourn gave him permission to ask. Salem questioned the reason Mourn gave him the information about the sloth was because he needed someone to protect Andreas, and further asked if he was right, to which Mourn stayed completely silent and took a sip from his cup of tea. As he nervously laughed, he questioned if that was a yes, further stating how he took such good care of Cain and even his son too, but soon disagreed with himself and questioned how he was forced onto Mourn by the Empire, and it was hard to teach him because he had no talent. After hearing him, Mourn broke his silence and abruptly addressed Salem, asking if he knew the origin of necromancy, to which Salem, with a confused look, asked why the sudden question. Reminiscing the tales told by the old folks, there was a beautiful lady and a mage. As time passed, they deeply fell in love with each other and promised to be together forever. However, their promise couldn't be fulfilled as the lady died, and the mage invented necromancy in the pursuit of immortality. But, more precisely, necromancy is the pursuit of immortality for those you love. It was born of the obsession to keep the loved ones with you forever. Hearing all this, Salem was left in a state of confusion and stated how it was an old man's tale, to which Mourn replied, maybe. Throwing the book on the table, Salem questioned if he wasn't also a sage and that he should have understood what he was saying. Hearing what Salem just said, Mourn laughed as he said to Salem, leaving it to my imagination, huh? With a cunning look on his eyes, he stated how it looked like Mourn had got another tie to the Cromwell family, besides that Cain. As he laid back on his chair, he confidently claimed that even if he forced Mourn, he wouldn't answer him, so he gave up. Meanwhile, Mourn diverted the situation by asking about Andreas, claiming he was curious to know what he thought about him. With an annoyed look, he shouted that he knew he saw everything using that zombie bug to snoop around them, which made Mourn laugh nervously as he realized he had been caught. With a grim smile, Salem told Mourn that he would tell him this much and reminisced about the time how Andreas used his own life to threaten the congregation and stated that kid is going to be the most insane person in this world, even crazier than him, to which Mourn, containing his excitement, claimed he was looking forward to it. Meanwhile, moving his hand forward with a pleased look on his face, he introduced himself as William Everlast Hollington. Shaking his hand back, he introduced himself as Andreas Cromwell, to which William, holding an envelope, welcomed him and asked to have a seat while Lucia stood beside them. As they were all sitting in the hall, William, opening the envelope, apologized for having Andreas to come all the way there just for the initial settlement of the potion profits, and how he just wanted to talk to Andreas in person since they were going to be working together from now on. With a big smile on his face, he sarcastically stated that he had become a close friend of Lucia as well. Meanwhile, hearing this, Lucia glanced at her father with a look of embarrassment. Andreas, with a pleased look on his face, replied that he had also been looking forward to meeting him and was grateful for all the help his daughter had given him and also for providing him with such a good deal. As William pulled out the documents from the envelope, he stated that he was the producer, further crediting that he was entitled to at least that much. Meanwhile, Lucia, being the proud woman she is, commented how Andreas should be grateful as she was the one who made sure that he got a good deal. Handing the documents to Andreas, William told him to take a look. As he was reading through the documents, he realized he would get 60% of the profits, and each one was worth 3 million wills, so the final amount that he would get was over 1.8 billion. Andreas was shocked as he realized that he had already earned that much money, and over 1,000 were sold in just a month. William explained how the potions were selling like hotcakes, further assuring Andreas that the next sum he will receive will be much bigger. Hearing this, Andreas, with an intrigued look, kept on reading the documents. Standing up, William smiled with joy and stated it was enough talk about business, further suggesting that they should have dinner, and since this was the first time Lucia had brought a friend, he was looking forward to hearing their stories, and in a joking way, he stated it was a boy she had brought home, to which Andreas stared at him with a look of embarrassment. A month had passed by. As Andreas boarded the train, he was thankful to the word of mouth, due to which the Everlast potion had become very popular. And not just for combat, but it was also taking high society circles by storm. Moreover, to increase production, the trading company decided to expand its suppliers and production facilities. Andreas, looking at his tablet, was still surprised as he never thought they would sell over 2,000 units in a month. If he had known this was going to happen, then he would have bought the tablet sooner. Reminiscing about the potions and the contract he had signed, he honestly didn't think that he could make so much money from the potion alone, and he had received plenty of letters showing support from the nobility, and it was all thanks to the potion's popularity. Looking outside the window, he thought to himself how he had 6 billion wills on him at the moment, and the Cromwell's estate is worth 3.5 billion, including the handling fees. As he reached out to grab his bag, he stared into it and wondered even if he bought it back, he would still have plenty of money to spare. As he reached his destination, Hartwell Station of the National Cemetery, he stood up, grabbed his bag, and got out of the train. With a determined look on his face, he thought that the first thing he had to do was to get the signet ring back. Soon, he reached his destination, the National Cemetery. He went inside the cemetery and made his way towards the house where Pimon lived. Pimon was there, but he was not alone. He was talking to a mysterious masked man who was standing beside him, which made Andreas curious as to who the mysterious masked man standing next to Pimon was. As Andreas reached near them, Pimon welcomed him, suggesting they should go inside and have some tea. Staring at the masked man, Andreas questioned who was the person standing next to him. With a cunning look, Pimon glanced back at the masked man, stating he invited him to be the guarantor as he thought it might be necessary in order to avoid any problems later. As Pimon insisted that they should get inside first, soon they all started to make their way inside the house. After they entered the house, Pimon and Andreas sat across the table, and the masked man was standing between them. While Pimon was pouring tea for them, Andreas, with a displeased look, stared at the masked man, wondering how it was a blatant lie that a guarantor was holding a sword and hiding his face. However, he knew Pimon had been practicing necromancy there for a long time, but he was no better than Sharon back in the game. He was just a small fry. Remembering how much he has evolved and gained a variety of skills compared to the last time he was there, he was confident that Pimon was no match for him at that moment. Evolved Nickel can also use aura, so unless it was against someone at the aura master level, Nickel can't be beaten. The only issue was how strong the masked guy was. He wondered if he should have released the energy in his Danteon. He thought holding back just before that would be enough, but now he was not so sure. Passing a cup of tea to Andreas, Pimon exclaimed that he had ordered the tea from a guy he knew in the congregation, and it's pretty good. Losing his patience, he gasped as he got right to the point, further stating that he would like to talk about the signet ring rather than the tea. Hearing this, Pimon, with a look of annoyance, accused Andreas for being so impatient. With confidence in his eyes, Andreas continued, saying that the corpse he bought from Pimon was mediocre, but since he had been so accommodating, he was willing to give him 5 million wills in exchange. Pimon was left in a state of bewilderment, as he couldn't comprehend how a person like Andreas was confidently offering such a large amount. Instantly, he gave a grim smile, stating how Andreas had become so great without him noticing and generous, as well further claiming despite being rotten, he was in fact still a count. Andreas knew it wouldn't be that easy, and a sly person like Pimon wouldn't agree to him. So he smiled and sighed without breaking a word. With a cunning look, Pimon stated how the offer Andreas made was a tad harsh, as the price of secrecy isn't that cheap. Glancing at Pimon, thinking how it was so typical of a villain like him, he further asked if Pimon was saying that he should pay more. With a cunning look, he smiled and pointed at Andreas's bag, telling him not to worry, and that he meant to trade it for the stuff he got at the congregation. As Andreas glanced at his bag, Pimon, staring at the bag, continued, saying that he heard Andreas got a lot of stuff, and all he had to do was give some of it to him. Giving a devilish smile, Pimon asked Andreas how the deal was and stated how it was not a bad one for him. Andreas, comprehending what Pimon just said, closed his eyes and took a sip from his cup of tea. Instantly, Andreas smiled with confidence and said he appreciated the offer, which made both Pimon and his guarantor left in a state of confusion. Putting his cup down on the table, Andreas said that he wanted everything to be clear, to which Pimon stared at him with an intrigued look. Andreas confidently took his stand and said 5 million wills and no more than that. Trying to control his anger, his eyes turned bloody red as he addressed Andreas as brat, stating that he didn't sound like he got what Pimon was saying. Denying what Pimon just said, Andreas claimed he knew exactly what he meant. With a grim smile, he told how he knew that Pimon never intended to make a fair deal in the first place. As Pimon realized how his plan had failed, he tightly grasped the edge of the table and stayed still in complete silence. Meanwhile, the masked man who stood beside Pimon, unsheathing his sword, claimed that they were done there, to which Pimon glanced at him, giving him permission. With confidence in his eyes, he gave a grim smile as he raised his hand up and agreed with the masked man, stating he was getting a little tired of all these charades, while summoning a portal out of which Nickel came out holding his sword, preparing for battle. Pimon and the masked man were both amazed to witness this commotion, while Andreas continued, stating he had just one question. With glowing red eyes and steam coming out his mouth as he breathed, it was Nickel Lifehill, a sloth phantom legendary, an undead of tier 5 with the traits of self-awareness. With sword as his mastery and a spectral form of sloth, came completely out of the portal, maintaining his fighting stance. With a grim smile, he confidently questioned if he really thought they could beat him. Hearing what Andreas just said, Pimon, with a look of frustration, wondered how a brat like Andreas could threaten him like this. Instantly, he stood up with a displeased look on his face and told the masked man that he would throw in extra money on top of what he had promised, to which the masked man maintained his fighting stance. Clenching his teeth in anger, he furiously ordered the masked man to kill Andreas right away. Suddenly, the masked man glanced back as he noticed something. It was none other than Nickel, who had swiftly sprinted behind Pimon, preparing to launch an attack. Meanwhile, he had no idea about the swift attack and was telling the masked man to take Andreas' stuff. Out of nowhere, the masked man threw his robe and quickly jumped on a table in front of Pimon, blocking Nickel's furious attack, creating sparkles as two swords clashed with each other. Pimon was both shocked and confused to witness Nickel attack him from behind. As the masked man's robe flew towards him, Andreas stayed still in complete silence, witnessing everything that was happening. Suddenly, he noticed something. It was sticky bombs that were planted on the robe that the masked man threw. Keeping his calm, Andreas quickly unsheathed his sword, thinking how he used to use those a lot in the game. While he swiftly cut down the bombs with several slashes from his sword, in the back of his mind, he thought how not only did the masked man stop Nickel, but he also kept Andreas in check, so he was no ordinary man. The battle between the masked man and Nickel was so fierce that sparks flew across the room and loud clashing sounds could be heard when their swords clashed onto each other. Meanwhile, Andreas was intrigued and couldn't help but watch such a fearsome battle. Abruptly, the masked man drew back his hand, aiming at Nickel to swing the sword at him, while Nickel, keeping his calm, carefully watched the masked man's moves, trying to comprehend how he should tackle his move. Instantly, the masked man jumped towards Nickel, launching a swift straight attack on Nickel, aiming for his head. However, Nickel, being an aura master, quickly managed to dodge the fatal attack. But, to his surprise, he got a small cut on his cheek. However, it was nothing for him as he continued looking for the masked man's weakness to launch a counterattack. Suddenly, Nickel quickly grabbed one of the legs of the masked man. With a confused look, he looked down towards his leg, but all of a sudden, Nickel pulled his leg, throwing him up in the air and preparing his sword to launch a mid-air attack. Using one of his hands, Nickel started to imbue aura into his sword, making it glow brightly, emitting immense aura from it. As he braced himself in a fighting stance to launch a fierce attack on the masked man, who was in mid-air and totally confused as to how a mere undead skeleton could do such a thing. Instantly, Nickel furiously launched his attacks on the masked man. The attack was so fierce that loud crashing noises and sparks flew all over the room as the swords clashed with each other. However, Andreas, witnessing the fight, was left in a state of shock as he wondered how Nickel imbued his sword with an aura. Looking at Nickel holding his aura-imbued sword, Andreas thought how after evolving and gaining a Danteon, it was not surprising to see that Nickel could also use aura, but looking at the masked man who was unharmed, with an intrigued look on his face, he questioned himself if the enemy was really that tough. Looking at how the masked man could fight toe-to-toe with Nickel, who was an evolved aura master, he was left in a state of confusion as he glanced at the masked man and asked himself who the hell he was. All of a sudden, the masked man vanished instantly, which left Andreas question not only about his strength and intelligence, but also his speed, which was amazingly fast. Abruptly, the masked man and Nickel leaped onto each other, taking multiple fierce swings onto each other. The battle was so fierce that the echoes of their swords clashing into each other could be heard as sparks flew across the room when their swords clashed. But the masked man had taken his toll. He was no match for Nickel, who successfully managed to harm him with several deep cuts on different parts of his body. However, Nickel was still offensive and took a big jump towards the masked man, planning to take a huge swing at him and ending the fight. But the masked man was not one to fall in despair and charged at Nickel with all his might and managed to strike through his forehead, piercing his skull. He thought he had finally managed to defeat Nickel, but was surprised to witness something in front of him. It was Nickel, but he had transformed in a soul-like form and looked as if the masked man's swing did not affect him at all. He turned invincible as any physical attack wouldn't affect him. The masked man was both confused and shocked as he thought he had got Nickel finally, but had failed. As Nickel came flying towards him, he panicked and was trying to evade Nickel's attack, but to his surprise, he was struck on his jaw by Nickel, who landed a powerful blow by his knee by slowly transforming partially from his soul form to his real physical form, leaving the masked man sent flying, destroying the table and window, while Nickel was in mid-air after launching the attack and Andreas stayed beside him watching the masked man sent flying. Andreas continued gazing at the masked man. However, Nickel was left in a state of confusion and shock as he witnessed the masked man trying to get up on his knees, but was instantly being pulled inside by several hands from the portal that Pimon had summoned. With mana on his hand, he glanced at the masked man addressing him as Dan, further asking what he was doing. With anger in his eyes and mana in his hand, he yelled at Dan, stating if he wanted the money, then he should start pushing himself harder. Meanwhile, witnessing everything, Andreas had a troubled look on his face as he wondered how Pimon had summoned the undeads while he was distracted. With a confused and intrigued look, he stared at Nickel and opened portals to summon his own undead warriors, claiming how Nickel, who fought bravely, must be a phantom. As undead started to walk out of the portal, Pimon, with anger filled at his eyes, exclaimed how it looked like Andreas managed to get a nice corpse from the congregation. As the sheer number of undead summoned by Pimon started to come out of the portal, he challenged Andreas to see how long he could last against his finest warriors. Suddenly, hands started to appear from under the ground. Cracks on the ground started to form simultaneously. As Pimon warned Andreas to not forget that they were standing on top of a mountain of corpses, soon a large number of undead corpses stood up, waking from their eternal sleep, marching towards Andreas and Nickel. Realizing that they had been completely surrounded, they had a troubled look as it was just the two of them. So Andreas advised Nickel to split up for now, and when the moment was right, they would take Pimon's back. After that, they both parted their ways and flew in the opposite direction. Andreas dashed outside the house, kicking and breaking the window, while Pimon's undead maintained their fighting stance, preparing to attack Andreas. However, Andreas was not the same weak guy as before. He had been training rigorously, honing his skills, stamina, and strength. He swiftly dashed past the undeads, easily slashing and beheading everyone that came his way. His speed and slashes were so powerful that several body parts of the undeads were flying midway in the air by his attacks. As he glanced to his right, the sheer number of undeads charging towards him made him draw to the conclusion that a sword fight won't be enough for them, and swung his sword up and counterattacked with his Earth Shield, attack where giant rocks appeared and crushed the undead soldiers, scattering bits and pieces of the undead soldiers. But it wasn't going to be enough. As he glanced back, he could see more undeads marching towards him. They felt no pain and were so relentless that even after having half of its body crushed, it was still coming towards him. With eyes filled with anger, he glanced towards the undeads, wondering how there was no end to them. Then he clenched his finger, and the rocks he just used to crush the undead started to float and break into chunks of rocks. Sharpening it using his earth magic, he yelled stone spears and launched several spear-shaped rocks, piercing the bodies of the undeads. He swiftly swung his sword, beheading one of the undead, while the other undead was watching in fear and despair. Suddenly, several undead archers were aiming at Andreas and launched their arrows towards him. Despite being caught up against such a sheer number of undeads, Andreas had already noticed the archers as well and quickly cut and deflected the arrows aimed at him. Not only that, he even cut off a hand of one of the undead and beheaded another one who had come near to him to attack. He then maintained his composure and dashed forward, defeating the archers and several other undeads. His attacks were so fierce and fast that undeads and their weapons were flying midway in the air. Watching Andreas create such havoc, Pimon cursed the undead, stating how they were only useless bunches, claiming they could not even defeat just one kid. Suddenly, something caught his attention. As he glanced back to see what it was, he had a nervous look as he witnessed it was Dan, who had come to his rescue and was blocking a surprise sneak attack from Nickel. The level of aura emanating from their sword clash was so intense. Nickel had truly evolved to a whole different level. The aura emanating from Nickel's sword was so overwhelming that it started to take a toll on Dan's sword, so he cursed Nickel for being such a powerful opponent despite being an undead. As Nickel stared down on Dan with glowing red eyes, a sticky bomb that was lit popped out of Nickel's robe. All of a sudden, a huge explosion was caused by the sticky bomb planted on Nickel. Dan had been tricked with his own little trick, and it costed his life. Meanwhile, Andreas, with all his might, was fighting the undeads alone and slashing each and every one of them who came in his way. Even though he didn't even have the time to use the recovery potion, he was still cutting down his foes. Thinking how at this rate, things could get really bad for him, he jumped and braced himself to launch yet another attack and swiftly attacked the undeads, cutting them. But his body had started to take a toll. He was gasping for air, but there was no end to the undeads. Suddenly, he pierced through one of the undeads who had come very close to attack him and wondered where Nickel was. Meanwhile, several other undeads marched their way towards Andreas, carrying different types of weapons. He was even using his bare hands to destroy the undeads, but he got a sensation that his whole body was going numb. It was as if every muscle in his body was being torn apart. Abruptly, one of the undead was unusual. It launched an acid attack from his mouth, but Andreas used his robe to save himself from it and wondered what kind of creature it was to launch such an attack. Several holes had occurred due to the acid attack of the undead. Glancing at the undead, he prepared his sword and swiftly beheaded the undead, wondering if he could even hold on until Nickel was back. Suddenly, something caught his attention. He was left in a state of bewilderment. As he looked up, it was an undead carrying a huge axe in his hand, aiming it towards Andreas. The undead quickly launched an attack, but Andreas managed to block it using his sword. Several sparks flew off as the sword and axe clashed. Seeing Andreas trying to withstand the undead with the axe, the other undeads also marched their way towards him, trying to take advantage. Instantly, Andreas kicked the undead on his jaw and kicked his giant axe off of his hand. The kick that Andreas gave in such a state wasn't powerful enough to affect him. Soon the undead rose his head up and stared at Andreas with a look of contempt. Andreas was getting weaker and weaker as he didn't even have time to consume potion to recover himself. Abruptly, the skeleton headbutt Andreas with immense force. Bearing such a powerful headbutt in such a weak state took a toll on Andreas. He got on top of Andreas and started to punch him rigorously, throwing punches after punches. There was nothing he could do than take the punches the undead was throwing. He wondered if he was going to die there, and that too at the hands of a mere skeleton knight. But if he were to die there, what would happen to Amy? What about Lucius's illness? And Vivian? He thought about how he finally had a reason to live. Blood dripped from his nose and teeth as he grinned with anger and yelled. He couldn't die like this. A bright crimson light started to shine from inside him. A system window popped up and stated, through continuous training, talent, and fierce combat, Aura had been awakened. As he looked down on his body, he could feel the surge of mana flowing inside him. Meanwhile, another window popped up stating Danteon had been activated and Aura could now be used. Due to the dual core trait, both mana and aura could now be used simultaneously. Then, all of a sudden, Andreas held his sword with a tight grip and cut off the undead that was thrashing with a single blow, yelling, "He's going back to where he belonged." As the shattered bones fell on his face, he was dripping blood from his nostril and mouth as he opened his eyes with a sense of accomplishment. Suddenly, a system window popped up stating an achievement, Second Awakening, had been achieved. Andreas, after his second awakening, slowly stood up and walked on the grass where all the remains of the undead were scattered. Andreas, with blood dripping from his face, grabbed his wounded hand and wondered how this battle was more troublesome than what he had previously thought. But looking at Nickel pointing his sword at Pimon, he knew that he had finally caught him and now could finally get his hands on his ring. Immediately, Andreas looked at Pimon and asked him where the ring was. Meanwhile, Pimon was scared for his life because of the sword that was pointed at him. Turning towards Andreas with a worried look, Pimon suggested he should put the sword away first, and only then could they talk, further telling Andreas to think about it. Then Pimon, pointing at the dead body of his partner, told them that with one of them dead, they could now negotiate a better deal. Meanwhile, Andreas glanced at the decapitated body. Andreas then slowly walked towards the decapitated body, and as he got closer to it, he stopped and started to look at the sword that was beside the body. As he looked at the sword, Andreas, in the back of his mind, wondered about what's to happen and thought what he should do now would be to use that guy's sword, as it might be better that way, and then grab the sword. With two swords in both hands, Andreas walked towards Pimon and again asked him where the ring was, to which Pimon could only stare at Andreas in bewilderment. With sweat dripping from his face, Pimon, looking at Andreas approaching him, yelled at him to wait and take it easy, but Andreas had lost all his patience and instantly slashed Pimon's right. The slash that Andreas sent was so fast that it instantly chopped off Pimon's hand, while all Pimon could do was scream in pain. As Pimon's hand fell on the grass, blood splashed from his arm, leaving him in extreme pain. Meanwhile, Andreas looked unbothered and cold as he swung the sword. Pimon instantly kneeled on the ground, shaking in pain, while Andreas threatened him to start talking, as he did not have any interest in discussing that with Pimon any longer. Having no choice, Pimon confessed, stating that the ring was in the cupboard in the bottom drawer of the cupboard in the house. Andreas, listening to Pimon moan in pain, stared at him as he had finally got the answer he was looking for. But then Pimon started to cough so uncontrollably that he spat blood from his mouth. Looking at his state, Andreas questioned to himself what was happening to him. Pimon was in immense pain as the veins on his head looked like they were going to pop at any moment as he grabbed his own neck, trying to stop his coughing, but failed miserably as the blood did not stop. Immediately, Pimon fell to the ground, struggling and screaming in pain, while Andreas still looked at him in confusion. Instantly, he stopped moving, and it was evident that now Pimon was dead. Andreas then wondered how he was planning to get rid of Pimon eventually, but looking at the sword in his right hand, he figured out that the sword was poisoned. Glancing at the decapitated swordsman, Andreas wondered who that guy was, as he was a skilled swordsman with a poisoned sword. Reminiscing to the time when he was summoned by Pimon, Andreas remembered how Pimon called the masked swordsman Dan, and as he tried to figure out who Dan was, a name popped in his head, so he questioned if that was Bloody Dan. To confirm his suspicions, Andreas bent down and reached towards the mask as he thought if it really was him, then he knew that there was more to that mask. Immediately as he took the mask, it looked as if the appearance changed, which further confirmed all of Andreas' suspicions about the mask. So then he put the mask on his face to see if what he thought was true. Out of nowhere, a blue light covered Andreas and magical changed his appearance and his clothes to look like the swordsman from earlier. Then taking the mask off, Andreas thought how Pimon had an appearance-altering mask artifact. Meanwhile, Nickel, standing behind Andreas, was looking at him in surprise as Andreas analyzed the mask. As all of his suspicions were confirmed, Andreas claimed how that guy was Bloody Dan, the one who started the war back in the game. And that later in the game, he would be hired to kidnap the Northern Barbarian Chief's child, which was the trigger that started a major war between the North and the Empire. Originally, the war would have spread throughout the whole continent, and Andreas would be dragging into it, but now witnessing all that happened, Andreas thought how it looked like he unexpectedly prevented it. Furthermore, Andreas knew that Bloody Dan was not the sort of character who was going to live out his life anyway. So he thanked him for the mask, and calling him Bloody Dan, told him that he would put it to good use. Turning towards Nickel, Andreas told him to go look for the ring and that he would clean up the mess there. After all the commotion had ended, Andreas went back to the academy and went to the Alvin Streets clinic to get his wounds treated. As Andreas was scrolling through the tablet to check the news about last night's incident, he came across an article that pointed out how black mages could be right next to you. The article further pointed out the terror that had happened in the National Cemetery, where Pimon the Necromancer and his hired sword fought over gold, killing each other. Meanwhile, Andreas, who had been patched up with bandages that covered most of his body, thought how it looked like he wouldn't be affected by that. Then as Andreas clicked more on the tablet, he thought how it was time for him to take care of the most important stuff and began to search for something in his tablet. It was none other than their family home that they had lost. In the screen of the tablet, the house could be seen along with the price of the house that was 2.5 billion. Andreas, without hesitating, instantly pressed the button to pay the price, and a notification stating how 2.5 billion, well including fees and taxes, had been paid. Andreas then took a sigh of relief and wondered how Amy would react, but abruptly his thoughts were interrupted as someone from behind him reached their hand towards him and closed his eyes, asking him to guess who it was. It was none other than Lucia, who blushed as she closed Andreas' eyes, but to her surprise, Andreas did not utter a single word. Both of them stood there in complete silence. Then Lucia stood still for a few moments, but later gave up and walked beside Andreas, telling him how he was no fun, to which Andreas just calmly addressed her with a yo. Lucia, looking at Andreas, placed a basket full of fruits and questioned what the curt reaction on his face was, even though his cute junior came to visit him. In response, Andreas, with a slight smile, acknowledged Lucia's presence and thanked her. Hearing Andreas thank her, Lucia started to mock him, repeating the words he said, while Andreas, with an annoyed look, wondered in his mind what he was supposed to say. Lucia then asked Andreas what actually happened to him, to which Andreas wondered what he should tell her. Instantly avoiding Lucia's gaze, Andreas looked the other way and told her it was nothing and that he just overdid his training a bit. Meanwhile, in the back of his mind, he wondered about his dead training buddies from yesterday. Lucia then responded by telling him if he kept that up, he would die one day, but suddenly out of nowhere the door to his room was pushed open, leaving them puzzled as to who it was. It was Vivian, who rushed inside the door. As Vivian entered the room, she looked straight ahead, searching for someone. Vivian then turned around and glanced towards Andreas, to which Lucia stood silently, and Andreas, in surprise, wondered what Vivian was doing there. Vivian, looking at Andreas, stood in complete silence as she saw Andreas covered in bandages. Not only her, but Andreas and Lucia also silently stared at Vivian in confusion. Abruptly, the expression on Vivian's face changed, and with her eyes wide open, she wondered what had happened to Mr. Fairy. Vivian could no longer maintain her composure and instantly ran towards Andreas. Vivian then ran past Lucia, who just stood in complete bewilderment staring at Vivian. Reaching Andreas, Vivian grabbed and hugged him. Witnessing this, Andreas was left baffled as he could not understand why she just ran and hugged him. Meanwhile, Vivian kept bending her head towards Andreas' body and told him that she was worried about him. Andreas finally understood Vivian's feelings and with a slight smile kept looking at Vivian in amazement. Meanwhile, Lucia, who had been standing silently, looked at Vivian and Andreas with a cold look. Andreas then told Vivian that he was all right. Lucia still could not understand the relation Andreas and Vivian had and just kept silently looking at them. And just like that, it took a week for Andreas to fully recover. After his recovery, Andreas, in a white carriage, went to the place he wanted to go for a long time. Inside the carriage, Andreas sat silently reading his book while his sister Amy was also sitting opposite to him, wondering how Andreas said he wanted to show him something and questioned what could be. With a worried look, Amy continued to wonder how she went with him because he said he got the ring back, but with concern asked to herself where he was taking her with all the curtains closed. Furthermore, Amy, looking at Andreas, was confused about how Andreas could afford that fancy carriage. Out of nowhere, the carriage driver called Andreas sir and told him that they had arrived at their destination, to which Andreas slammed the book he was reading. Amy then called Andreas' big brother and asked him where they were and further questioned him what it was that he wanted to show her. In response, Andreas told her that she would see everything when she got off the carriage. Out of nowhere, a voice startled Amy, and as she tried to recognize it, the voice stated how Andreas was right and that she would know it as soon as she got off the carriage. Instantly, the door of the carriage was opened by a lady with glasses who was wearing a maid dress. She then called her Lady Amy and welcomed her back. Amy instantly recognized the maid and in surprise yelled, calling her Lupin, and questioned Andreas what was going on and why was Lupin there. In response, Andreas simply told her that he asked her to work as their head maid again. With a concerned and worried look, Amy glanced at Andreas, calling him big brother, and told him how he knew that they couldn't afford that right now. Then she instantly grabbed Lupin's hand and started to apologize, stating how her brother was still naive about how things worked, while Andreas, who was silently sitting, slightly smiled. As Amy was apologizing to Lupin, her gaze turned towards what was in front of them this whole time. She then immediately took a step out of the carriage. Lupin then held Amy's hand as she got off the carriage with her eyes wide open, shocked with where they were. As Amy got off the carriage, she started to walk ahead, looking at their old home where they were born and raised by their family. Amy then, with a look of surprise, glanced at the castle in amazement and called its name Apple Wolf Mansion. After all, it was their own home. A home that was once filled with laughter and happiness. Standing there, all she could do was remember the happy times about their past, along with their father and Andreas as a kid. After reminiscing for a while, Amy then tired back and glanced behind her and asked why he brought her here. In response, Lapinia just handed her an envelope and told her to read that. While passing the envelope, Lupin just smiled, looking at the expression on Amy's face as she saw the mansion. Immediately, Amy read the document that was in the envelope and asked if it really was true. With sweat dripping from her face and eyes wide open, Amy asked if he bought their home back, further questioning him how. Instantly, Amy, baffled with the whole situation, asked if Andreas bought their home back by doing something bad, while Andreas took out his tablet and was ready to show her something. Turning the tablet towards Amy, Andreas told her that he invented a potion. Meanwhile, Amy just stared at the tablet to see what was in there. It was an article about Andreas and Lucia and how they invented the point together. As Amy read the article, Andreas stated how that was the reason that allowed him to buy their mansion back. Furthermore, Andreas told her that she didn't need to work so hard anymore, and that from now on, he would make sure that there was money on her card every month. Listening to everything Andreas just said, Amy was left speechless as she processed everything. Then Amy looked down on the ground as guilt filled her as she remembered about how, without knowing all that, even though Andreas worked so hard, just because of a ring, she had told him to not come back anymore, and that he didn't have to pay her back, while all Andreas did was tell her to wait. With tears running down her eyes, she started to cry uncontrollably as she thought about how she said something so cruel to him, and that she told him not to come back, further claiming that she didn't mean to say any of that. She kept crying. Andreas then came closer to Amy and patted her head, calling her silly, and told her that of course he knew that. Further, Andreas told her that from now on, he would behave like a responsible brother. Amy still could not stop crying and said that she had always believed in him, but back then she was just so mad, to which Andreas responded, stating how he knew it. Looking at the two siblings, Lupin also felt a sense of joy and couldn't stop her tears of happiness.